Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hello and welcome to Railway Conversations with Doc Frank. I'm your host of this podcast, Doc Frank, and my episode today is with Barry West from England. He's a trainer for train drivers and he has done a lot of driver training, particularly related to ETCS and ETCS with automatic train operation. In our conversation, we will talk a lot about the Thameslink project and the use of automatic train operation over ETCS. You will hear some maybe surprising parallel between Formula One racing and automatic train operation. We will talk about automatic train operation in low adherence conditions and a lot of other interesting things. I hope you enjoy it. This podcast is not sponsored by third parties, which will be handy for you, but I do want to let you know that I offer advanced trainings for CBTC and ETCS for both people with previous signaling knowledge and without previous signaling knowledge. These courses are called Kickstarter, so there's a CBTC Kickstarter and an ETCS Kickstarter, and the idea is really to kickstart you on your journey towards CBTC or ETCS. The training portal where you find information about those trainings and can enroll to the next run is docfranktraining.podia.com. That's docfranktraining, one word, .podia, Podia.com. I look forward to seeing you at one of my trainings. And until then, please enjoy my conversation with Barry West. Barry West, welcome to the show.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. I got hold of you via LinkedIn when you responded to one of my posts, and I noted you have done a lot regarding driver training. Specifically driver training for ETCS, which I'm interested in a lot, but probably also driver training in general. Now, I understand very little about driver training other than it's absolutely necessary, particularly if you introduce new technology. And maybe you just tell us a little bit what driver training is, how you got into this field, and just educate us a bit.
Okay, yeah, fine. Well, I've been a train driver for a long time, like nearly 20 years, and progression into driver training. And about 7 years ago, we started to see ETCS be deployed in the UK. First of all, from like the testing side, and I was one of the drivers tasked with driving those test trains initially. And then from that experience, learning from the testers and the train partners, etc., it kind of naturally progressed to training our company's drivers. So from that early stage of literally just getting us on a test track to operate the system, to putting together a driver training course that we could roll out, was quite useful to see that continuity from what the testers are seeing to where the drivers would be when they become to be trained. So jump forward a few years, the course was written by our training school. Myself and a couple of colleagues had some input into what would be needed from a driver's point of view operationally, tying in the technical specs to what a driver would see and how that would work to train drivers actually learning the system, to kind of where we are now. Delivering driver training to the drivers specifically at the minute is with GTR and Thameslink. And now, as I've spoken to you before, we're rolling out driver training to the East Coast.
When you said you started with ETCS, was that for the Cambrian pilot project or was that for something later?
It was later. A couple of my colleagues have been to the Cambrian on the pilot project, but there's the European National Integration Facility in Hertfordshire, which is a branch line. That's where we started. So to jump back a bit further, we had an initial course put together by one of my colleagues who's now actually in Australia working with Brisbane Rail, I believe. So he trained 3 of us to get us ready to drive the test trains on the National Integration site. That's where Siemens and the other train partners put together their packages, their testing to get it ready to move to central London through the Thameslink core. I'm sure you've heard of the level 2 and ATO section. So that's specifically what we worked on.
Yes.
So from the ENIF testing to the testing in the core, jump into the driver training. These are the drivers that we've trained. I'm currently on about 300 now trained drivers that use ETCS level 2 and ATA through the core at the minute.
Yeah,
but Cambrian.
Thameslink is, of course, a very interesting project in general, because from my recollection, it was pretty much the first time ever that ETCS level 2 was used in a city environment to actually beef up capacity. Because normally, if you take a plain vanilla ETCS level 2, if anything, it reduces capacity, because the braking curves are often more stringent than they would be without ETCS. And other than that, it's just relying on the fixed block system. And if you don't change the underlying fixed block signaling, then you're not changing anything regarding capacity. And,
that's true.
Then, of course, the other thing you've got with ETCS level 2 are the capacity constraints with GSMR, because every train connection eats up an entire communication channel and the number of channels is limited. And that was normally the other reason why you never found ETCS level 2 in city railways, because there are too many trains to be properly controlled with GSMR. And I think Thameslink was one of the first projects where that problem was circumvented and they were able to control a sufficient number of trains.
Yeah, definitely. I remember, again, going back to when we were driving the test trains, the conversations that the engineers were having. GSMR was an issue at first that the technicians had to resolve, and it was one of the first in the world to have that sort of system in that sort of area, and also the added element of ATO. For the Thameslink capacity targets, I think it was essential that they installed ATO, not so much ETCS, because like you said, I don't think that makes much of a difference.
Yeah.
But because they could install ATO over it, then they could achieve their capacity targets. But I think without ATO, I'm not so sure whether we'd be seeing ETCS at all through the core. Maybe we would, but that city area probably doesn't need it as such without the added element of ATO.
Yeah, and that's probably another reason why ETCS level 2 was previously not used in cities, because ATO was simply not there. So the industry have spent the last few years working on a standard for ATO, which would be interoperable and could become part of the next version of the ETCS standards, the next baseline.
Right.
Which was actually due for 2022. I'm not quite sure where it is, so they're probably a little bit behind in announcing that. I don't know why, but it should come out anytime soon. And the idea was to include the ATO specification, ATO over ETCS, in that next version of the ETCS baseline. So let's see how that happens. Yeah, but my understanding was that the solution for Thameslink was already based on the work on this ATO specification, so that there aren't so many changes afterwards to bring it in line with what will end up to be the European standard for ATO over ETCS.
Right, okay.
So let's see how that works. But I mean, for the time being, Thameslink is pretty isolated anyway. So and the key thing is really to get the capacity that they need. And from everything I heard, it seems to work well, right?
Yeah. I mean, it does for the most part. I mean, there's a few, especially in the early days, if you like, of implementation, there was a few teething problems, but we kind of expect that with any new technology in any field. What we found is that the engineers that changed the software, if you like, they've tweaked ATO and how it behaves to almost mirror how a driver would behave in certain scenarios when there's a short headway, for example. The defensive driving techniques drivers use in the course specifically is they'll kind of wait for the platform to clear before they drive in to complete their station duties. With ATO, initially, ATO was driving right up to its maximum headway and then stopping mid-platform quite often, which could cause a few potential issues with passenger safety, etc. But ATO, like I say, has been tweaked, so that kind of doesn't generally happen now unless there's an issue with the train ahead or the headway is stopped. So they've tweaked ATO over the sort of, since we've had it, I suppose it's been 2018 was when it was first used live in the core. So since then, there's been quite a few changes to make it work a little bit better, but it does work really well generally. The only, it's not really an issue. It's just when a driver has to use on-site mode, for example, with poser signals, that can cause a few like problems, and the drivers have to just behave and operate it slightly differently.
It's an interesting,
yes, it's for the most part. Sorry.
It's an interesting point that you mentioned there, because I could imagine that a lot of people have some misconceptions about ATO. They think it's a piece of software that just falls from the sky, or that will be delivered by a supplier of ETCS, and then it will magically work and drive the trains in a perfect way. When in reality, it's just a piece of software that needs to be designed, right? And ideally, it needs to be designed in a way that emulates the perfect train driver. So it basically starts with the human train driver, how the train driver would drive the train in the most perfect way. You basically take out all the little mistakes and so on. So it's a bit like Formula One. We're trying to get the ideal round at the minimum time, and then you say, and once you've got it, you say, well, how did you do that? How can we replicate this for, I don't know, for 57 times so that we can win the race? And this is a little bit how I see ATO, and I think that the train drivers would probably have quite an important role to play in ATO, to basically inform the design, how the trains need to be driven on certain parts of Thameslink, for example. I'm not sure whether that was how it worked on Thameslink, but I would have thought, when I did the planning here for CBTC, which of course has ATO as well in Perth, I was envisaging that the supplier would have to work with the drivers to basically take them along on the journey, so that the drivers have an understanding how the design of ATO evolves, and how the design of ATO basically does nothing other than trying to replicate the perfect train drive, which is derived from the behavior of the actual human train drivers, which is a very different thing than saying, well, the computer will solve this and everything. And then you say, well, yeah, but actually this is not how we drive on our railway. This is not how we drive on our lines. And
That's a really interesting point, and a very good analogy.
Did you notice anything that drivers were involved in the design of the ATO for Thameslink, or how did they do that? Did you have any visibility of how that worked?
Now we're discussing it, and it's not something I've considered before. I'm surprised I haven't thought about that, but no, we didn't really have much of an input, especially in the early stage. What I would say is probably what we've just discussed about how a driver behaves to how ATO behaves. With the conversations we've had through the early training courses and the software changes, that might have had an influence in how ATO has been sort of evolved. But certainly in the initial design stage, I don't think the drivers were really asked or had any input into how ATO would be initially designed. But that is a really good point, especially the comparison to F1. That really kind of is how ATO is behaving, I guess. But to answer your question again, I'm waffling a bit, is that no, we didn't really have a lot of input at first, but again, the evolution, I believe, it is now being taken on board how a driver would behave to how ATO should behave. And again, looking at what ATO was brought in specifically the Thameslink for the capacity increase, what we see with driver training, especially day one and day two in practical hand, is how the drivers are, like, first of all, quite taken aback is how fast that train would be approaching like an end of authority or red, because it is an overlay period, and that's like a big shock to them at first, but they do quickly get used to it. We have a policy in the UK, it's probably global as well, with defensive driving. Some drivers call ATO offensive driving because it goes so fast, but it doesn't really. We know it's designed safely, but from initially seeing it, it's like, whoa.
I probably wouldn't call it, if I think about it, I probably wouldn't call it offensive driving. I would call it fearless driving.
That's a good one as well, yeah.
Because
it is.
If you think about it,
the you said the train drivers were surprised like how fast the ATO was approaching the end of authority, but at the same time it was perfectly safe. So you would be able to drive a train like this, to drive a train let's just say offensively towards the authority limits and the permitted speed profiles. But humans very often tend to be a bit more careful, like saying, oh, well, yeah, what if the brakes don't work as they are supposed to? What if it happens this, or I just miss the right braking point by a few seconds or something like that? So humans tend to build in a lot of buffer, a lot of reserves, which ends up reducing the performance of the train ride. But I could imagine, especially if you say that initially there wasn't much input from the drivers, then the supplier, I guess, will have designed the ATO, but then there will be the moment of truth when the ATO is let loose on the drivers. So when you start driver training, day 1, day 2, and the drivers see how ATO behaves, then one is that they say, oh, this thing is driving the train much harder than I would ever dare to. But on the other hand, they may also find where they say, well, this ATO, it's good, but it's not perfect. Yeah. And so I have seen a couple of areas where I, as a human, would have driven the train better than the ATO does. Yeah. So almost like a competition, like a computer game, where you're basically trying to beat the computer in chess or what have you. And well, basically try to, this is one area where I don't really stand a chance, because the computer is so much better. But this is another area where I think I have an edge, which could be used then to basically improve the ATO design, the ATO driving profile. And one example that I keep mentioning in my training courses when I talk about ATO, which I think is very relevant, is what do you do in poor weather conditions? So I'm not sure whether that's so much a problem in the UK, because you've got pretty much bad weather all the time. So the prejudice goes. But here in Australia, for example, especially here in Western Australia, we've got sunshine most of the time. And if we start getting rain or drizzle or everything, then you've got this like soapy substance on the road and on the rails and pretty much everywhere, just the dust that's getting moist, and then you've got the slippery surface. And that leads to a lot of slip slide events if the trains are driven in the same way as they would be driven in sunshine for the last 3 weeks, So what an experienced human train driver would do, he would adjust the driving to the driving conditions, to the weather conditions. So that would mean in order to avoid wheel slip, they would just try to accelerate the train a little bit smoother. To not like full throttle, but just a little bit smoother to avoid wheel slip events. And the same with braking to avoid wheel slides. You just brake a little bit more careful. You start the braking process earlier. You brake a little bit more careful, which means it takes you longer to slow down and stop the train. Now, this would need to be translated into an ATO driving profile. Because what is if you have an ATO which keeps driving the trains hard every time, but then you have weather conditions that lead to slip slide conditions, and then all of a sudden you've got slip slide events with ATO. What do you do? And
that's a very good point.
Yeah, and what I normally say is that the ATO should have a second driving profile for poor weather conditions. I'm actually recommending 3 ATO driving profiles for like normal operation under different circumstances. And I'm not sure whether Thameslink has this, and I'm not saying Thameslink is bad or anything. I'm just conveying to you what I would see sensible, and then maybe you can feedback that this is what we've done at Thameslink, or I don't know, but it would be a good thing to have. So I'm normally saying to have one normal ATO driving profile where you try to save some energy. Yeah, you know what coasting is, and normally that's the trick where ATO can save a little bit of traction power energy. Actually, not just a little bit, quite a bit. But if you go into coasting, you're losing journey time. You take longer from point A to point B because coasting will be slower as if you just cruise along with continuous speed. But with coasting, you lose speed a little bit, and that means you also lose journey time. So you've got to have some kind of slack in the timetable to be able to get from A to B while doing some coasting and saving some energy. So if you just drive the train hard, then you minimize your journey time, but you don't have any energy savings, right? So the standard driving profile should have, I believe, some energy savings in there. That means you need some slack in the timetable. Now, if the train is behind schedule, if you are delayed for whatever reason, passengers take longer to board the train or whatever, then you try to catch up to get back onto the timetable, which means the train has to travel a little bit faster. And it does achieve that by basically doing without the coasting. So you basically throw out the coasting phase, which means you can cruise at line speed all the way. You gaining some journey time, you compressing the journey time, which means you win some time back towards the timetable. And if you have a delay, you should be able to catch up with that. So this is normally called a tight driving profile. So that's the second. And then the third one, which I think you need, is this bad weather profile. Where you just have more careful acceleration, more careful braking. So instead of focusing on coasting on energy saving, or instead of focusing on making up time in the tight profile, you're now focusing on more careful acceleration and more careful braking. And this is where your timetable slack goes into. So you have the same amount of timetable slack in all three scenarios, but you're using it for three different purposes, But this is my theoretical understanding how I think it should be. I'm not sure whether suppliers are actually designing it like this, or whether they just say, we just do one thing and that's that.
I mean, that's a really good. Have you got anywhere with that? As in, obviously, it's a good idea. Have you suggested that to anyone? So they have like a bad weather profile, or is that anything that happens?
Anyone who joins my training courses where I'm talking about ATO will get exactly that. So I'm definitely teaching this in my CBTC trainings, in a CBTC Kickstarter, when I talk about ATO, because that's a standard functionality of CBTC. And for ETCS, ATO is still a relatively new topic. But going forward, I'm just about to revise the ETCS training, the ETCS Kickstarter that I'm doing. So for my next run in May, I will have a revised and an updated version of the course. And I will certainly do a little bit more ATO. And I guess what I just told you, I will transfer into the ETCS training as well, because ATO becomes more and more relevant. We have this in Australia as well, a similar approach to Thameslink we will have for Sydney. So Sydney is doing ATO over ETCS, and Brisbane is also doing ATO over ETCS. For a slightly different reason, Brisbane is mainly using this for accurate stopping in the tunnel, because they're building a new tunnel underneath the city center. And in the stations, in the new stations in the tunnel, they will have platform screen doors. And they're basically using ATO to stop the train precisely where the platform screen doors are, so that you've got an alignment between the platform screen doors and the train doors.
Okay. That's still GOA2 then.
Yes, it is. It has to be GOA2 because not the entire line end to end is fitted with ETCS.
Of course.
And so you will travel in and out of ETCS territory. That means you've got to have a driver. You can't do anything more than GOA2. The other thing is that the railways we have in Australia, with the exception of Sydney Metro, are all like in an open air environment without specific protection of the corridors, without quarantining of the corridors. And that's another reason why we still need drivers on board of the train to basically intervene in emergency situations and just keep an eye open what's happening on the rail. So GOA is still what we have to do. The only GOA4 railway we have in Australia is Sydney Metro, because this has been designed from the start for an unattended train operation where the lines are either in a tunnel or they are on elevated sections and they are protected from the outer environment. And this is what you need to have for unattended train operation, right?
Okay, that's the same as what we're seeing in the UK at the minute. So just going back to the lower Dijon, I can kind of tell you what we do in Thameslink.
Yes, please.
There's no obviously setting or ATO profile for reduced weather or lower Dijon at present. But what we instruct drivers is if lower Dijon mode has been set on the ETCS, so your DMI panel shows the ETCS lower Dijon, drivers just simply aren't allowed to use ATO. That's the only instruction we have. But going back to what you said, that would be fantastic if there could be an ATO profile that would work with lower Dijon mode. My limited understanding of a lower Dijon mode, when that's set, that changes the brake curves, etc. So in my mind, I don't know why ATO can't still drive to that, but I get there's the risk element that it can't. But an ATO lower Dijon mode itself would be fantastic if they could figure something out. But that's what we do on Thameslink anyway.
Yes. So what you just described is, of course, a good workaround where you say, okay, well, if my ATO doesn't have that, if my ATO doesn't have a low adhesion mode, and in poor weather conditions, a normal ATO driving would lead me into problems or would increase the risk of slip-slide events, then it's better to just switch off ATO and let the train driver do it manually. But it's still a workaround, as you said. If the ATO had the capability of running trains in a low adhesion profile, then and well, maybe that's an idea to take back to Network Rail to your test facility. I think it should be possible, and I think this is definitely something where I would see that the human drivers actually inform the design of ATO. So if I was an ATO designer sitting with a supplier, I would be highly interested in basically observing the train drivers. So if you have this low adhesion conditions, how do you drive the train? How does your driving behavior change? And it will most likely just come back to more careful acceleration and more careful braking. But then you say, okay, wait a minute. You can't tell a computer, be more careful. Computer doesn't understand it. You can tell the computer, reduce the acceleration by 5% or 10%. This is something that the computer understands. So how can we translate your behavior of a more careful acceleration into something that can be coded in a computer, that can be understood by a computer, so that I can design it into my ATO driving profile? So I was really hoping going forward that there would be a real interaction between the train drivers, like using the experience in order to optimize the ATO. And from a human factors perspective, I could imagine that for a train driver, the acceptance of an ATO where they have helped designing it, where the driver basically says, this ATO has a little bit of my driving experience programmed into it, that the acceptance should go up, that the acceptance should become better.
What a great shout that is.
You're a train driver yourself. What would you think of such an approach?
Yeah, that would be fantastic, because the acceptance of even just the ETCS level 2 is a bit obstructive by some. So like you said, if we have a massive input into that ATO design, then the acceptance level would be easier. It would be an easier transition going from legacy signaling training to drivers accepting like level 2 and ATO, etc. on any new technology. So yeah, that's a great idea, really, if we could be involved with that design. Because as you probably know from what you see in your training, that acceptance can be a bit of a brick wall a little bit for some driver training, because some drivers have been driving trains for a very long time. That new tech is a difficult thing to get across initially. So yeah, I'm repeating myself, but if drivers have more of an input, that probably would help that barrier be broken down a bit quicker.
Yeah. And I mean, from a human perspective, this is not rocket science. Yeah. I mean, what you're basically doing otherwise is you take drivers with, I don't know, 20, 30 or even more years of driving experience. And of course, with a certain pride in their in their driving capabilities, their driving experience, and then you say, forget about this. Here's a computer program, and this is now supposed to drive the trains much better than you ever could. We say, wait a minute. Let's see about that. Yeah, you know. And this is from a human perspective certainly not the best way to basically get people to buy in and to accept things. Yeah, so people may feel almost like challenged. Yeah, saying, oh, wait a minute. So without even talking to us, you're just presuming that this computer can drive the train much better than any of us, not just myself, but my colleague Bob over there and Jeff in the corner, who is even 10 years more experienced than I have. And then I don't know, Jimmy over there in the other shift. I mean, he is known to drive the trains faster than anyone else. And you basically throw all of that away and you say, hey, it's a computer program now. Yeah. So I believe stakeholder acceptance is super, super important. And especially when introducing ATO, the driver, the train driver is a stakeholder in an environment where you're introducing ATO in GOA2, which means a driver-supported automatic train operation. This is so critical. I cannot imagine any more relevant human interface, any more relevant stakeholder interface which needs to be okay, where in the worst case the opposition of the drivers could really be a showstopper for the entire thing. And if it's not by the drivers, it may be by the driver union. And now we really get into the interesting area, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really good point. So the acceptance is a big thing. But yeah, and again, I know I'm repeating myself, but going back to what you said, driver input at a more design stage would help a lot, because we do see a lot of obstruction. Obstruction is probably not the right word, but fear maybe of ATO driving the train, because measure and talk on the railway, as you know, is a big thing. So getting the positivity across about our implementation of ETS and ATO training to drivers was very difficult from day one, because most drivers that turned up at first were naturally a little bit apprehensive, not against it, but what is this new thing you're throwing at us? And slowly over time, the message is getting across that actually it's a really good system, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly initially, if we could find a way to I don't know, promote ATO before and level 2 before we start training, that would be a good thing. Yeah. I mean, what we've actually started to do as well as a company, I say we, but GTR as a company, they're having we've done Thameslink, we've got that in place, we're training that now, but that was literally Friday afternoon, you're driving legacy signals, Monday, get out on an ATO course. There was no sort of previous introduction to it or anything, but the lessons we've learned from that to where we are now with East Coast deployment, because we're literally just about to start training drivers on sections of the East Coast on the Northern City Line, just a small section of the first part of the East Coast bit. But we're having a lot of open days, like PR events, collaboration with other companies. We've got some freight companies come to us. So we're really trying to get the message out before we start any sort of driver training or implementation. And I think the feedback we're getting from that is a bit more positive. So drivers do feel more involved in that initial process. So when they come to sit their course, they'll be like, oh, that's what they were talking about the other day. These are the questions they've asked us. So I think we're slowly learning.
Involvement is a good word. And I think it's important to keep a balance. Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly not saying if you have hundreds of train drivers, I just don't think it's realistically feasible in a project delivery environment to get each and everyone involved in the design of ATO, because then it's going to take you 20 years, right? But what you probably need to have is some kind of representation of the train drivers and some kind of input that they don't feel isolated, they don't feel ignored, but they know there's some kind of where they can contribute to shape the design of ATO. So, for example, let's just say, for argument's sake, Network Rail wants to introduce this concept of a low adhesion ATO driving profile. They think, we heard this from Frank, it's a great idea, so let's just retrofit this to our system, to Thameslink, for example. So how would you do that? Or how would I do that? if I went to a driver trainer like yourself and ask you, give me 3 train drivers which are particularly well in low adhesion conditions, I'm pretty sure you would be able to give me, I don't know, the top 5 or the top 10, or but a subset of train drivers out of the hundreds that you've got that are particularly talented or have a good track record, like minimum occurrences of slip slide events, some whatever statistics you may have, and or even within the drivers, that they may have certain favorites. I say, well, this guy has a particular strength, like combat weather, and he's really getting into gear, yeah, and so on. So having a subset of drivers where the rest of the driver community will say, okay, we feel represented by those guys, yeah. So if these guys have an input to a low adhesion driving profile, we are on a good path. We have a lot of trust into that system, and a lot more trust than somebody sitting in an office cubicle in Germany or somewhere, trying to invent how Thameslink should be driven in low adherence conditions, right? So the trick is to get some involvement of the stakeholders without letting it going out of proportion. That's probably how I would do it, and often this is not done, and it's like blocked off, maybe by the supplier, maybe even by the project manager on the client side, because it seems like an extra effort and something that slows down the progress of the project. But I'm not so sure about it. I think overall, if you find a way to spend 5 more minutes, well, it's not 5 minutes, but spend a little bit more time to bring a group of critical stakeholders along, I think can save you so much time later on in the project that the initial investment is really worth it. That's at least would be my attitude as a project manager for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, definitely. Because if it takes, like say, a little bit longer initially, it's going to save you a lot of time going forward, especially with that specific subject. If there's an input, drivers are going to be way more appreciative of when they come to actually learn it and train it, because they can see that the input they've had, not just train drivers, it could be any walk of life, couldn't it? But any input initially is always going to be a good thing. I mean, we've actually seen evidence of that, really. Again, going back on the training we've done with the Thameslink program, like I said to you, it was literally, you're on a training course Monday. There's no pre-planning to it. But with the East Coast one, drivers have seen this system already before, so they've kind of had a bit of, not so much of an input, but an understanding. So they're more appreciative of it going forward.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good idea if you could get that to happen.
And the other thing that you would achieve with that is if you really have a subset of drivers, and I would almost see them as champions or multipliers of the technology, because if you bring them along, if you basically show them and let them have an insight what the technology does, how it's designed, that it's not like black magic or so, but this is really based on their own experience, they are likely to go back to their colleagues and saying, hey, this is cool stuff what they're doing over there. So they're picking the brains of me and my 2 colleagues and put it all into this computer program. So this is basically gonna be the best of the 3 of us, which basically means, I mean, we keep talking about this amongst the group of drivers. So it's kind of the best of all of us. And so they basically start doing advertisement for this new ATO technology, which again, I think reduces any apprehension that drivers may have, because they say, hey, if Bob is trusting the system, then I will at least give it a fair go, and see how it works. Whereas before that, they say, whoa, I don't know what's coming, and I've got this training on Monday that I didn't know about on Thursday, so whoa, let's just see. And they basically started training like this. Yeah, they started training like, oh, wait and see. I don't really think that's that good, in contrast to, well, let's just see. I mean, if Bob thinks it's fantastic, then let's just see whether it's really that good. So
I mean, everyone trusts Bob and Jeff, don't they? So if Bob and Jeff say it's good, then it's a good point.
Acceptance is such a big thing. It's such a big thing. Yeah, I told the story before in one of previous podcast episodes, so sorry for repeating, but you haven't heard it, I believe. When I was involved in the planning here in Perth for CBTC, we had a first meeting with the representative of the drivers union. And this guy came in the room with black jeans, a black T-shirt with some rock group on it, and then of course the emblem of the drivers union and so on. And he basically started to really go at us. Yeah. So the question was, are you going to replace train drivers? And we were planning to do GOA too. So we said, no. There's no way that we ever replace train drivers in Perth. So this is really the ATO supporting the train drivers. We will always have the driver in the cab. And so he was happy with that response, obviously, because his members weren't losing their jobs. So that was number one.
Yeah.
And question number two, just after that, is if the ATO doesn't do what it's supposed to do, or if the ATO is doing a poor job, what can the train driver do to override the system? And I said, the simplest of all things, what the train driver would do normally, just put the hand on the bloody lever and do something with it. This overrides the ATO. Oh, this is fantastic. From that point on, after those two questions and those two answers, the whole conversation went so smoothly. And the guys afterwards, the guys of the railway organization said, Frank, we never had a union meeting like this. I mean, the guy was friendly to you. How did you do that? I was just lucky because one, I didn't have any baggage with the union. Yeah, so I never pissed them off in the past. And secondly, I just gave the right answer on two very critical questions and two very deserved questions, very logical questions. That were on the guy's mind. And apparently I answered convincingly enough that he actually believed me. Yeah, so he actually believed me. It wasn't just lip service by me that, we will solve your concerns. It sounded genuine enough, because it was genuine. I mean, I was talking my truth, that he said, I believe this guy. I believe this guy that he's not doing us any harm with his technology. And after that, he was open to be educated on what the project was going to do, what ATO was going to do. He was happy after the meeting because now he, with his new knowledge, he could go back to his members and appear like the informed driver representative who made sure that no driver will be sacked over the process and so on. So he looked like a hero all of a sudden. And that was great. That was great for him. I would have felt very good in his position. I mean, I felt good in my position because the meeting went so well. And but this is so critical, yeah. If you start up and you have some old grudge against the other party, which you have very often, especially in union relationships, and you kind of start on the wrong foot by giving a slightly different answer, or an answer which isn't quite that convincing, where he said, this guy has lied to me 5 times in the past, so do I really believe him this time that he's telling the truth? So that's really where that baggage thing comes in. But really bringing the stakeholders along is so critical, and particularly drivers and drivers union, they can put so many obstacles in the way of really introducing it and accepting the system and getting it going. It's not funny. So I think it's very worthwhile to bring them along and like spend a bit of extra effort to really bring them along on the journey.
Yeah, definitely. It really, really helps, doesn't it? Especially with getting that implementation and acceptance across. And rightly so, union reps and drivers all need to be involved in the process, because like you mentioned black magic earlier, there is a little bit of that fear that what is this sort of sorcery they're using? But it's not that fearful, and the key point you made there as well is train drivers aren't losing their jobs for most of this technology. There's always going to be train drivers, and that's a big fear within the industry, especially when you talk about automation, isn't it? So, like you said, getting that across first. So it sounded like you did a really good job with that union rep in that meeting to get him on board so quickly. I've sat in quite a few meetings with course design, with union reps, company council, etc. And you're right, it is about being open and honest about anything. There's nothing that we won't answer if we can, and we're not trying to hide anything from anyone. And everyone is on the same team. That's the phrase I keep hearing.
Yes.
Is that there's not two sides. There's not a blue and a red team. We're all blue team or red team, whatever your colour might be. But everyone's in it together.
Yeah.
And with these changes that come in, they're needed. They're very good for the railway, especially. We all need to work together, don't we?
Mm. Yeah, I had a second example also in Perth. We were considering a new signaling system, a simplified conventional signaling system, basically as a migration strategy towards the introduction of CBTC. And my idea was that the signals, so I was really going down to a one aspect signal. So I wanted to keep it as simple and rudimentary as possible. So we came up with the concept of a one aspect signal, where you say, well, either it's illuminated, that means you can go, or it's dark, that means you have to stop, which is as per today's operation. You find a dark signal, you stop, right? So that's in line with what the driver would do intuitively anyway, right? So, and then I thought, okay, well, the one aspect that we have should look different from the yellow, red, green aspects that we have on our normal conventional signaling system. So we thought, okay, let's take a white aspect. Right. So we talked to the drivers about this concept, and the driver said, well, this white aspect there, I understand that why you're doing that. Why don't you make this green? And I explained, I said, well, I thought we use a color that you don't have in your current signals so that you can clearly see it's a different signaling system. And they said, no, make it green, because we know what green means. Just make it green. It's fine. I said, fine, let's make it green. So the drivers were happy because they basically influenced the design, the conception of the new signaling system. And any time later, when somebody said, well, how can you make this green? This is, well, because the train drivers wanted it like this, and they are the users. They have to live with it. So the drivers were happy. The possible resistance became in a full-blown support, and it was fantastic. So simply by taking the stakeholders along, simply by saying, well, you guys have to live with it. You guys are the ones who are looking at these things each and every day on every shift, on every train run that you do. How do you want it? And
it's really important. It's a big important thing.
So I think we got into discussion recently about hybrid level 3 when we basically established contacts on LinkedIn. Have you been involved in any driver training to do with hybrid level 3?
No, not at all. We did, I think, 2 tests. Well, the test that you've seen, that I think it was on YouTube, I believe.
Yes.
And then another one. But again, we were just the operators, facilitators to drive it. We were obviously interested in how it was working and where it was going, but for driver training, not at all.
I would have been interested because what hybrid level 3 basically is, it's an ETCS level 2 with some added features for higher performance. And I would have been interested how those additional features were received by the drivers, whether they how readily they adopted these new concepts, or to what extent they said, well, I like this feature, but I don't like this other feature at all. So if you had been involved in that, I would have been very interested in that, merely to get a better understanding of the acceptability of hybrid level 3 with an important stakeholder party, which is the train drivers. But if you weren't involved in that, it's not a problem. I think the experience from Thameslink and ETCS in general was probably already quite well. And I hope that this may lead to an improved training for East Coast. And I think everybody will probably hope that the entire rollout of ETCS in the UK will start getting a little bit more traction.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we are getting there. I mean, going back to hybrid level 3, if there are any plans in place, I'll certainly let you know. If we get involved in any sort of concept training or whatever, I will let you know. But as it stands, that's kind of up to the testers to test if they want to. But going forward with the driver training, yeah, I think we are gaining more traction on the East Coast with what we've learned on Thameslink. A good example is like from day one training to where the drivers are on day 5, that change in their attitude and their acceptance of it. We're seeing that more widespread now. So across depots, it's a lot more accepted. Drivers are actually looking forward to doing the training now, whereas before they were probably quite apprehensive initially. So it's a good thing. I mean, I think if we could get like industry collaboration with that as well would be helpful. So conversations like this with yourself, even like over coffee or in a pub or whatever, it helps. It's a good thing because it's coming everywhere, isn't it? So
yeah. How do you deal with the timelines of ETCS introduction? Where I'm basically coming from is if you train a train driver with some new features, with some new functionality, ideally you do the training and then you want them to implement it pretty much straight away. So if you have a large cohort of drivers that needs to be trained, the first drivers will be trained many months before the last drivers will be trained. By that time, the first drivers that got the training already need a refresher or so, because they will have forgotten most of it if they didn't have a chance to apply it anywhere in between. So how do you see this as a problem, and if so, how do you deal with it with those long time frames where you need to start training your drivers, even though the actual implementation of ETCS may still be several years away? I'm not sure how your driver training fits in time wise. So how do you balance this? You know my point. You know where I'm coming from.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with ETCS specifically, we're lucky because as soon as a driver's trained, they can use it straight away. So they might be trained on a Friday, and on a Monday on the next shift they'll be able to use it because we've got the overlay system in the core area. And with the Northern City line is where we're starting probably. Springtime, I guess, we'll start the driver training. That's going to be an overlay for a period of a year as well before they actually go signals away. So as soon as the driver's trained, they can use it, so they retain that knowledge. And with further up the East Coast, they're having the operational migration area. That's going to be an overlay system as well, specifically designed around driver training and implementation, and then they'll slowly, gradually signals away. So
okay.
But we have seen problems. Sorry.
Yeah. So what I understand is you have an early fitment of a part of the line with the specific purpose of familiarizing the driver, so that once they got trained, they have an area where they can keep applying it, so that the knowledge doesn't get lost over time. That's smart. That's a good idea. Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah. I mean, I think the core area, Thameslink core, that just naturally happened because it was only a short section. So any driver doesn't just drive that little bit. They've got to drive outside the ETCS area as well. So naturally, they were just using it from day one when they were trained. We have seen a similar thing with other training, like traction, for example. When we introduce new traction, we give a driver a course. The first week's course wouldn't be driving that traction for 6 months. So we designed a refresher course, if you like. So that's another way we could get around it. But with ETCS, we are lucky where we work is that they can use it from day one.
As they say, luck comes to the prepared, right? So I think if you had the idea of introducing like a piece of what you call it, migration zone or migration track or something like that, with the purpose of driver familiarization. This is not luck. This is just bloody good planning. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to take credit, but as long as
it may feel lucky in hindsight, and we say, well, thank God we have that. But it's actually good planning. Yeah. So And thinking about this, I mean, one of the things that I'm driving quite hard in my trainings is that whole change management aspect, where you say, well, if you introduce a new technology like ETCS with ATO or CBTC or something like that, which is so fundamentally different from the signaling technology you used before and that everybody was used to, you've got to think about what the change effects are to the various stakeholders. Yeah? Starting with the train drivers, who obviously have one of the biggest changes in front of them. And then you need to think through how do you bring people along with those changes? Yeah, what are the changes in their roles, change skill requirements, what they need to be trained at, and how you retain the knowledge of training with over time, with refreshers, with I don't know, with some kind of practice area or so. And so all this falls under change management, and this is super important, especially when an organization is not used to it. Yeah, when they never had to do change management in conventional signaling. Yeah, I mean, you had to train the maintainer that this is a new type of point machine, and here are the 5 differences to the last generation of point machines. Yeah, that was pretty easy, but it didn't affect the train driver. It didn't affect the signal and the control center. None of these guys were affected. But now all of a sudden you've got a technology where almost everybody is affected. And now, I mean, just alone that the train driver suddenly has stuff on the train. I mean, you had this before with AWS and TPWS, so it's not completely new to you that you've got some signaling equipment on board of your train. But it's still the first time that you actually get to see like a movement authority in your driver's cab, where you say, oh, wait a minute, this is what I'm supposed to look at. No longer the signals out there. I'm supposed to look at my computer screen instead. Like, ignore everything that's out there. Well, that's new.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you say, it's a big change for everyone. And like you say, not just the train drivers. We're lucky we've got some good simulators that we use before the drivers go out actually live. But I mean, even like the signalers, especially in the Thameslink, in the early implementation of that, it was all new to them, so they all had to be trained. There's some differences in operation instructions surrounding where ETCS is fitted and isn't, for diversion routes and what's required with that. So getting everyone to change those types of things as well, not just the drivers, everyone. It's a big task, isn't it? I mean, we've been working quite closely with signalers to ensure their scripts, if you like, are exactly what the drivers need to see and vice versa. But yeah, change management is a big thing.
Okay, I think that should probably be the ideal close to the conversation. I'm conscious of the time because you need to go to work. Yeah, it's pretty early at your end, whereas I'm preparing for my weekend, but you're just starting your day. Thank you very much for making time so early in the day. I thought it was a very interesting conversation where I at least learned quite a few additional things about train driving, and maybe you got 1 or 2 good ideas out of this as well. Whether it's good ideas, we will see how the rest of the industry responds to that. But it's much appreciated that you found the time and talk to me and to our listeners. So thanks very much, Barry.
No, thank you for asking me to come on. It's a real pleasure, because obviously I've read some of your stuff already anyways. It's really interesting to talk to you. You know what you're talking about, that's for sure. But
great.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, and for all the listeners, if you liked that conversation, which I hope you did, or actually I'm pretty sure you did, interesting as it was, then do all the usual things with podcast episodes that you like, and subscribe and download it and tell your friends about it, that it may be worth listening to them as well. And until next time, keep it simple and bye for now.